you get this. The alternative media, Jerry. That's where you hear the truth.
You're listening to Media Monarchy with James Evan Pilato.
You're listening to The Morning Monarchy for Friday, April 21st, 2017. I'm James Evan Pilato from MediaMonarchy.com. The third Friday of every month is Book Smarts. Does Trump really care about the forgotten man? During his victory speech, after the shocking conclusion of America's Next Top President, I heard Trump use a phrase that had me immediately run into my bookshelf. It was the title of a promo book I had grabbed while I was still back at the commercial radio station. Probably grabbed it off of Lars Larson's book pile. I knew that the use of that phrase was important and that it would likely be a part of sort of the context of the coming Trump years. Yeah, that is unless some giant war comes along to take away our worries about what's happening at home. But, what are the odds of that? In an Orlando Sentinel article from January 2nd of this year, Trump dare not forget his promise to the forgotten man. It notes one key to Trump's victory was his ability to break through the blue wall of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. A clue to how Trump breached this Democratic stronghold can be found in one line of his victory speech. The forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no longer.
Ours was not a campaign, but rather an incredible and great movement made up of millions of hardworking men and women who love their country and want a better, brighter future for themselves and for their family. It's a movement comprised of Americans from all races, religions, backgrounds, and beliefs who want and expect our government to serve the people, and serve the people it will. Working together, we will begin the urgent task of rebuilding our nation and renewing the American dream. I've spent my entire life in business looking at the untapped potential in projects and in people all over the world. That is now what I want to do for our country. Tremendous potential. I've gotten to know our country so well. Tremendous potential. It's going to be a beautiful thing. Every single American will have the opportunity to realize his or her fullest potential. The forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no longer. We are going to fix our inner cities and rebuild our highways, bridges, tunnels, airports, schools, hospitals. We're going to rebuild our infrastructure, which will become, by the way, second to none. And we will put millions of our people to work as we rebuild it. We will also finally take care of our great veterans.
So who is the forgotten man? That depends on who you ask. On April 7th, 1932, the forgotten man was thrust on the political stage during a fireside chat made by Democratic President Franklin Roosevelt to the American public on a new medium, radio. During his address, Roosevelt referred to, quote, the forgotten man at the bottom of the economic pyramid, end quote. The phrase described Depression-era men who were poor and needed a New Deal. At the time, Roosevelt's supporters feared he was sowing the seeds of class conflict. Undeterred, Roosevelt believed his party's future depended upon casting the poor as a community of victims of the rich who never pay their fair share. For the past 80 years, the fires of class warfare have been stoked by the left's appeal to the forgotten man on the bottom rung of the economic pyramid. Author Amity Shlaes reminds us that to accomplish this political objective from FDR and those who follow in his footsteps, they hijacked the original meaning of the phrase. In The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression, Amity Shlaes reports the phrase originated with Yale professor William Graham Sumner.
Yeah, in your great new book, The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression, you talk up the need and the acknowledgments for a new history of the Depression. Existing accounts, as you point out in your introduction, tend to fall into one of the following camps. And there are the people who generally support FDR and his and Hoover's interventions into the economy and society as staving off fascism and communism after the stock market crash and then in 29 and the Depression kicking in a few years later. And additionally, you talk about how people in the supportive camp, what we might talk about how the 30s interventions kind of corrected a morally corrupt 1920s economic boom, which was, widespread. Then the critics who tend to fall into another camp, that federal responses, especially by Hoover early on, tightening the money supply at by the Federal Reserve, Smoot-Hawley tariff, which kind of blocked American trade from doing much, actually caused the Depression, which was then extended and exacerbated by FDR's subsequent New Deal programs, et cetera. So your book is, the subtitle is A New History of the Great Depression. How does your book fit into these existing arguments, and then what new are you bringing to our understanding of the Depression?
Well, one of the important things about the existing argument is that it's all about Keynesianism and whether government spending can cure the economy when it's ill for the short term and the long term. And scholars overlooked the cost of uncertainty, what we would call now the unknown unknowns, in an economy. And because both administrations, especially the Roosevelt administration, was so unpredictable, that hurt the economy very much. When I went back and looked and saw the extent, I was astounded. So uncertainty is a factor that I thought needed to be explored. People who said, I will not invest until I know what's going to happen.
Okay, and it's not just I know what's going to happen in the economy, but what the government is going to do.
What the government was very unpredictable, and everyone overlooked the cost of that. You heard the phrase bold, persistent experimentation, and we learned that was good. Somebody had to do something, was what we learned. But what I saw when I went back to the years, especially the second half of the Depression, was the enormous cost. There was a second thing, too, which is there's a school of economics called public choice theory that says, very simply, government is no better or worse than a business. It's a competitor.
Right.
It's
and it doesn't have moral high ground, but it also seeks to maximize its, what it controls or its market share.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And if sometimes on the radio I use a crustacean image. It's like a lobster. It will eat anything. It wants to survive. It will compete with anything, and it can be a cannibal. So when you look back at the 30s, what you discover if you use the public choice lens is the extent to which it wasn't about a virtuous government and bad business people, but rather about people in office using that office to compete with the private sector for power. And much of that struggle in the book literally inhered in the power business, utilities, because there's something about power that attracts strong people. And of course, as I go through it, you'll see in the book the government wins and the private company loses in the form of the Tennessee Valley Authority.
An illustrated edition of Amity Shley's #1 New York Times bestseller, The Forgotten Man, featuring vivid black and white illustrations that capture this dark period in American history and the men and women from all walks of life whose character and ideas helped them persevere. This imaginative, illustrated edition brings to life one of the most devastating periods in our nation's history, the Great Depression, through the lives of American people, from politicians and workers to businessmen, farmers, and ordinary citizens. Smart and stylish, black and white art from acclaimed illustrator Paul Revoche provides an utterly original vision of the coexistence of despair and hope that characterized Depression-era America. Shley's narrative and Revoche's art illuminate key economic concepts, presenting the thought-provoking case that the New Deal regulation prolonged the Great Depression.
There's a kind of emotional impulse. The government must do, it must connect with the people. And you see that much earlier in American history. You see it right after the turn of the century with Theodore Roosevelt. But when you come to the Depression, the constraints disappear.
Well, it's just like Katrina. It's like what's happening in China right now. All bets are off when you have a crisis and a disaster. You move to that part of the brain that is the disaster mode part of the brain, and you do stuff that you normally wouldn't do, and maybe it's warranted and maybe it's not. They use the excuse of the emergency of the Depression to expand the federal government mightily.
All right. Now,
that too.
Let me quote you in The Forgotten Man again. Quote, "To justify giving to one forgotten man, the administration found it had to make a scapegoat of another. Roosevelt and his staff were becoming habitual bullies, pitting Americans against one another." Tell the story of the National Recovery Act and the Schechter family.
This is a story I stumbled on, and I fell so much in love with it that I thought, well, this is the book. We'll forget about the rest of the book. The Schechters were, the center left has their famous lawsuit, Gideon's Trumpet, Gideon v. Wainwright. This is the conservatives' Gideon v. Wainwright. The Schechters were small businessmen. They were chicken butchers in Brooklyn. They didn't speak English very well. They were quite religious. And they were the authors of the New Deal and the National Recovery Administration, which was the law that was the centerpiece of the New Deal. We have our NRA. They had their NRA. Had written this very strong law to govern all aspects of the business economy. And it was quite questionable whether it was constitutional, and they knew that. So they sought out a case to test its constitutionality, set up a case they thought they could win. And they picked these little chicken butchers. And one reason they picked them is the chicken butchers barely spoke English, so they were an easy target. Right. There was this sort of cultural bigotry component in those days. Bigotry was much more obvious in those days. They were little Jewish chicken butchers, and the big lawsuit came from the Justice Department, which had no accent, spoke good English. Their business had already been established to be racketeering interstate, so therefore, Commerce Clause might not be a problem. And they were very surprised to be set up. They were set up, and they were charged with many, many counts of violating the law. And some of the violations, these crimes that were alleged, were crazy as concepts, such as your prices are too low.
Prices are too low. Consumers were able to go in and choose their own chicken.
Consumers could choose their own chicken. That was against the rules. Can't choose your own chicken under the New Deal.
When this graphic edition was released in 2014 of The Forgotten Man, the Washington Times wrote that The Forgotten Man is above all a critique of the progressive effort, and the artistic rendering of a cast of progressive characters uses shadow and obscurity to emphasize the top-down, faceless, bureaucratic style of managing the economy. A customer insists to the authoritarian poultry inspector, Mr. Alampi, "The Schechters know their business, mister," to which Alampi replies, "That's for the code to decide, pal." Roosevelt's face is never seen in this graphic edition of The Forgotten Man. What we are often treated to is a looming cigarette holder protruding from a silhouette of his head. Also powerful is the constant refrain of The Forgotten Man, a phrase originally used to refer to the public victimized by redistributionist schemes. The Forgotten Man, wrote Charles Sumner, Yale professor, in 1883, is the man who pays, the man who prays, the man who's never thought of. The same Forgotten Man phrase was co-opted by Roosevelt to strike a chord with the economically downtrodden, an irony that Mrs. Slays, Mr. Rivoche, and Chuck Dixon do not let us forget. A significant dimension, no doubt intentional, is in the work, is the political and policy similarities of the 1930s and now. Now, if you go to YouTube, and you can find those clips, and of course we'll have all this in the show notes for The Forgotten Man, you'll find that most of the people and places praising and pushing Amity Shley's work are not quite the so-called free market champions we'd like to see. Instead, it's just the same old usual suspects. The Council on Foreign Relations, of which she's a member, the Hoover Institution, where that clip of the author just there talking about the Schechter brothers comes from, and the Charles Koch Institute, yes, of the infamous Koch brothers. After Obama's win in 2008, Schley's wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post called A Chilling Uncertainty, The Lessons of Roosevelt's Experimentation. CFR has a copy on their website. 8 years later, after the inauguration of America's next top president, she wrote another piece, this time for Bloomberg. In the article, Defining Forgotten Man is Key to Trump's Presidency. She writes that the Forgotten Man is not likely to be forgotten in the Trump presidency. So who precisely is the Forgotten Man? Is it going to be the Forgotten Man at the bottom of the economic pyramid? Or is it going to be the man who pays, the man who prays, the man who is not thought of? Which Forgotten Man will Trump make his own? That 2014 Washington Times review we mentioned earlier also illuminates us on some of the fans of Schley's work. We just didn't really know their names yet, unless you were from Indiana. The Times notes that the original 2007, words version of The Forgotten Man was, quote, denigrated by intellectuals like Jonathan Chait and Paul Krugman, but praised by former Senator John Kyle and former Representative and now Governor Mike Pence. He's now the vice president, a heartbeat away from the presidency, as they say. So it seems we reach another false choice between fake heroes and villains. The new swamp fillers and the district criminals aren't going to do anything real for any of the real forgotten men or women, or anyone else that doesn't come from Goldman Sachs, Exxon, Raytheon, and the rest. The real forgotten men and women need to forget about relying on the state and remember to try and empower themselves the best they can. Does Trump really care about the forgotten man? That's your April installment of Book Smarts, my friend.
You're listening to Media Monarchy with James Evan Pilato. Since 2005, Media Monarchy has covered the real news about politics, health, technology, and the occult, all remixed with music and media that matters. Go to MediaMonarchy.com/support and become a monthly subscriber so you can help keep independent, non-commercial, alternative media going and growing. Thanks.